Hello and welcome back to the Questioning Behaviour Podcast. My name is Sarah and as always I'm here with my lovely co-host Merle van den Akker.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects solved.
Today we are bringing you another episode in our series of early career researchers in behavioural science / behavioural economics / behavioural spaces. Today we have a lovely guest, someone who I know off of the podcast, Jesal Sheth. Probably butchered your name horribly. I'm so sorry. Jesal, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience? Who are you? What do you do? And how do you get there?
I'm Jesal Sheth, and I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Nottingham. And I'm seconded into Nest Insight as a senior behavioral scientist. Before I did my current job, I did a PhD in economics from the University of Nottingham as well, with a specialization in behavioral and experimental economics. So yeah, that's me.
Pretty good.
Okay. Yeah, so we've got Nottingham representation in today. So, I feel outnumbered as is. But I always really like to know, why did you decide to do a PhD? Why did you not decide to take any other trajectory?
Yeah, so I think there were three big reasons why I decided to do a PhD. The first one was plain simply, I enjoyed learning the subject. I did it all the way right after my 10th grade, which in India is when you're about 15 or 16. Mm-hmm. And then I just really enjoyed learning the subject, and I knew I wanted to learn as much as there was to do. And from then I did my bachelor's, master's, and then the natural progression was to do the PhD. But I think the more sort of defining reason for me to do the PhD was for the kind of work I wanted to do, which I realized on the way while studying the subject. It was more like technical and analytical kind of work. And for that, I thought PhD would just give me the right skill set and the freedom to basically do that kind of a role and a job going forward. And the third reason, which is more personal, is my dad always wanted to have a doctor in the family. Obviously not a medical doctor, but I thought I'd make him proud.
I'm sure he is very proud. And I would just like to mention that the PhD doctor's title was the original doctor's title. So all these medical doctors can just F off.
Yeah.
I love that. I love your third reason. That's so wholesome. I'm interested in your second reasoning, sort of, doing the PhD to equip yourselves with sort of the technical skills and the sort of the knowledge for the jobs you wanted to do. How did that pan out? Did it work out the way that you thought it would? Did it equip you for the job in the quote unquote real world outside of the PhD?
Yeah, absolutely, I would say, because the kind of work, for example, that I do now is exactly between policy and academia, which is the kind of work I think I would love to do going forward. So what I basically do is I take questions that are relevant to policymakers, to more sort of UK financial institutions, in this case, it's Nest. And I work on questions around how do you engage Nest members to engage with their pension accounts? How can you analyze what the impact of the policy of automatic enrollment into retirement savings in the UK has been on broader consumer financial outcomes, which is what my current research focuses on. So I think those kinds of questions need to be approached with quite a rigorous analytical approach and the skill set that you need to address those questions. So I think the PhD has sort of equipped me with those skills that I need for it. And yeah, I think the behavioral science being quite a new and growing field, it just sort of adds that different dimension to looking at these questions. And it seems to be on a full swing. I think you know better than I do, given you do such great, amazing work with reaching out to the behavioral science audience with your podcast and inviting different people on it.
Yeah, it's a pretty positive answer. Was there anything that you were sort of a bit shocked about when you transitioned out of the PhD, or something that you thought, oh God, I don't think I'm very prepared for this type of job? Or was it all pretty good, straightforward?
So I think personally for me, since I did my bachelor's, my master's, my PhD all back to back, the transition outside academia was generally what was a little tougher than what like I was expecting it to be. But I think like I was equipped with like the technical skill set that you need to perform well at a job that is more analytical and technical, but I wasn't sort of trained enough to think about, I don't know, the practicalities of how do you apply behavioral science in bigger organizations. So things like how do you run an RCT? How do you convince people that you need a control group in an RCT, for example? So these little and more fundamental things you just take for granted because you've been around people who know the subject, who know the field, who understand the need for certain things to be a certain way. So I think translating that to a common non-technical audience was one of those challenges that I had to learn my way into.
Yeah, good response. It's a good answer.
So I'm quite curious. So we've talked about the fact that you've learned a particular skill set throughout the PhD, which would make you more employable afterwards. But it is, although you are currently in a postdoc, it is quite heavily hinting at a skill set, which I would argue is much more industry based. So did you go into industry after doing your PhD?
Yeah, that is right, actually. So after my PhD, I started work as a behavioral scientist at the Banking Standards Board, which sort of worked with UK financial institutions like banks and building societies to help improve their organizational culture using behavioral science approaches. And so I started work with this organization, and that sort of introduced me to this whole world of applied behavioral science. And like I said, it was a little challenging at the outset, but it was easier to pick up. And especially because I was skilled on a technical and analytical level. Certain things just came more naturally to me.
Yeah, that answers the question.
So you decided to go into industry. So I guess I'm always curious about knowing this from people who have engaged in doing a PhD. Did you know that you wanted to go into industry as soon as you started the PhD? Or is this an idea that came about somewhere halfway through the PhD? Or why did you go into industry, I suppose? I mean, clearly you have the technical skill set, but what was the motivation for it?
Yeah, so I wasn't always sure that it was the industry that I wanted to go into. I kind of knew what job I wanted to do, as in like what skill set I wanted to acquire and use and do going forward. I think through the PhD, I realized how the economics job market works, the uncertainties kind of that come with it, but also obviously the perks that come with it, given like academia gives you that freedom, that intellectual challenge that you're looking for. But I think for me, somewhere during my PhD, I realized I don't want to do research just for that intellectual challenge. I want to do it because I want to see that impact of my research and contribute to advancing questions that are very relevant to the broader society and the economy. So I think the impact aspect made me decide that applying behavioral science and going into a field or outside academia where you can do this and see results of your research more actively and would let me do that. And the second was, I think, like trying to build this network in the industry, which I didn't have because I went straight from bachelor's, master's, and PhD. So I think it was important to get into the field outside in the real world, figure out what are the pressing questions, what are the challenges that need to be addressed. And so to get that feel for these challenges and these issues, it was important to sort of go back into go to the real world and figure this out. And it kind of worked because I still do like research that is quite rigorous in the academic sense.
So I get the motivation for doing a PhD, all three very sound reasons. I get the motivation for wanting to go into industry, into the real world, all sound reasons. But then you came back to do a postdoc. So explain the train of thought here.
So currently, I'm doing a postdoc. But like I said, because I'm still like a part of Nest Insight, and actually my postdoc is funded by Nest Insight, I sort of sit somewhere in the middle. I wouldn't say I'm back completely into academia, although a lot of my projects and a lot of my work is in that area. But it was sort of, the reason was that in the industry, there was this, how do I put this lightly? Like the amount of research that I would have liked to do ideally was not as much as a purely industry job would offer me. And I know there are a lot more organizations like think tanks that would let you do more research of the academic kind, but I just wasn't in a place like that. So I sort of wanted to come back a step and find this middle ground between being in a place where you can do still longer term research projects and answer questions more thoroughly, and combine them with like more shorter term projects, which require turnarounds in maybe 3 to 6 months, for example.
Right. I mean, this sounds like super interesting. You've like paved this middle ground, which to me sounds like a super attractive like type of career. But from where you are now, does it seem like there is like a set trajectory of what a career sort of balancing the middle between sort of communicating with industry and academia looks like? Because I think we've got very sort of clear models of this is how you succeed on the academic job market. You know, you go through this level, and this is what you're going to need to do to be successful and reach the next stage. And in industry as well, it seems like if you're in the right industry with the right contacts, you can sort of navigate your way through that world. So for you, where you're standing right now, does it seem like there is a way forward to navigate this position, or do you feel like you're sort of making it up as you go along?
So I think this model of an industry-funded postdoc is gaining a bit of prominence of late. So I would say people are realizing that how important it is to bring in those recent insights and the cutting-edge research into the practitioner world. And they're appreciating this connection that an academically trained person like I or you can bring to an organization, for example, like Nest. So it's sort of like you bridge the gap between the two worlds, which have traditionally not been communicating or been communicating very little with each other. And you just help sort of advance science and also help address questions and challenges that are pertinent to the society much more rigorously and effectively, hopefully.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the dream job position, I think of anyway. And I just want to know, like, if anyone is listening to this and is maybe thinking, you know, that sounds amazing, that's what I want to do. Like, would you have any advice for anyone who's maybe in their PhD right now of how do you find these positions that navigate both worlds of industry and academia?
Yeah, so I think what would have helped me before I started my PhD was to get a bit of real world experience and like a bit of a insight into what are the challenges, what are the questions that are relevant to like institutions that deal with more practical problems. Because I think at some level, my PhD wasn't directly sort of applicable into the real world, although you could make connections. So I think that experience would have given me an easier route or an easier sort of start to a job after my PhD in the real world.
Okay, that's a really, really interesting point. So in hindsight, well, of course, hindsight is 2020. It's the only thing that is. What do you think you would have gained from taking up industrial experience between your master's and the PhD? Just a better perspective on what's applicable, or do you think you would have gained more from that experience as a whole?
Yeah, I think I would have definitely gained a lot more on the whole. So apart from like issues that are relevant, how do you navigate big organizations, sort of the kind of work that you definitely want to do. So I kind of knew what I want to do because I'd spoken to enough people in the field. I'd seen like few people in my family do it. So I had that atmosphere of what it is like to do a job based in the field. But I think for someone who doesn't come from that background, that would be a good sort of introductory phase into what it's like to work in the area. So it could be things like you can be a research assistant if you think you might want to go into the academic sort of line. It might be internships in now organizations that actually have behavioral science teams. So learning what kinds of problems they address, how do they address it. So a lot of the times, like consulting organizations also now address issues using behavioral science approaches. So they have these teams. So to find out whether that's what you want to be doing, because a lot of the times in the practical and more policy sort of institutions, you often learn what works, but not so much probe into why it works. Yeah. So are you happy with those kinds of answers to questions is what you need to sort of find out. What is it that motivates you and makes you want to work in the field?
Yeah,
absolutely.
So I'm interested, I'm not sure whether you did go. Did you go on the economic job market as sort of, even if it was sort of a backup option?
No, actually I didn't go on the economic job market. I started applying only to positions in the industry at first. Also because I sort of started looking quite ahead of my submission time. So I was sort of just 2.5 years into the PhD, and yeah, it was quite early. And then I submitted at the end of my third year. So I had a job like 4 months before I submitted. So it wasn't that well into the PhD. So yeah, I didn't go on the job market. And I think the reason for that was actually, first of all, I didn't feel like I was 100% prepared for it. And I mean, you will never feel like you're 100% for a job market either way. But I just wanted to make sure I submit and work on these, actually first worked on these research projects that I had ongoing during the PhD, get them at least well into the publication route, either an R&R or revise and resubmit at a journal before I make my position stronger on the job market. And the other reason, and like I mentioned before, was I wanted sort of to build that network because I knew I wanted to do a job that has this impact aspect to it. So I wanted to build this network within the practitioner world and also access data and get access to the population of interest that you want to be eventually affecting through your research. So I think those reasons sort of gave me a natural way into looking for a job in the industry at first. Although I did hope at some point that I would also be fit for a job in academia later, which fortunately kind of worked out for me. It was a gamble that I took back then.
Yeah. I mean, you sort of dropped the bomb that you were only like 2.5 years through your PhD when you're looking for jobs. Why look so early? Were you just sort of not desperate, but keen to sort of wrap it up and move on to something else? Or was there some other motivation?
I think desperate is a fair question. Desperate maybe sounds way too personal, but it's the thing. Like, no, I mean, let's be really, really frank here. There are people who realize, and I'm not saying this is the case for you, Jesal, but there are people who go into the PhD relatively quickly, but slightly too late, I'll explain that in a second, realize that the PhD is maybe not fully for them, and then what? Because especially if you enter the PhD with this idea that, yes, you're going to be an academic, and then you get a taste of academia and you're like, oh, hell no. You're going to have to reorient what you're actually... No, but this is like, let's not pretend that this is oh so funny and that this doesn't happen, because this does happen. And it's a valid point to raise. If you go into the world of academia through PhD with just a very focused idea of, I'm going to be an academic and I'm going to be a specific type of academic. But then you start to realize that every idea you had about academia is completely based on delusions and hearsay, and none of it is actually true. You're probably going to have to adjust. And some people adjust to the extent where they do not want to be in academia anymore. But if that is the case, the PhD that you've hopefully so carefully crafted yourself, and hopefully with some help, might not actually be what gets you hired in industry, because these things don't naturally overlap per se. So, I mean, I don't, obviously, again, not saying this is the case here, but to look for a job 2.5 years in just to get to know the market and know how to orient yourself, if the market you thought you wanted is no longer the market you do want, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And you can call it desperate. I've had very desperate moments in my PhD where I was like, I'm not doing this. Academia can like stick it where the sun don't shine, but I'm not continuing in it. So to actually get back to the question, what made you look for jobs 2.5 years?
Yeah, so I think for me, it was because I had things that, or like the requirements that I needed to fulfill the PhD. So the standard 3 chapters you need. And this was, I think, I would say partly a mistake on my part, in the sense I viewed the PhD as a degree to achieve, rather than having many research projects to actually go on with even after your PhD. So I was like, fine, I have 3 chapters, that's it. I can submit now and get done with my PhD, get my degree.
Right.
So I think that was partly the reasons why I was like, okay, I'm nearing the end. I don't know what the job market's like. I don't have prior experience, so I should start looking early. So it was combined with my risk aversion, whether I would find a job later. So I started looking, I interviewed, but I realized later that, okay, at 3 years, I could submit and I could start this job. So it eventually worked out in the PhD sense, but probably I could have taken another year, which most of us do, and started a few more projects, for example. But sort of that's just how it went.
It seemed to work out. And there doesn't seem to be a hint of desperation at all. I was just, putting my own desperation onto you, projecting. No. Okay, so that's fantastic. You kind of had a very practical approach to the PhD and very strategic approach to sort of your decisions on where to go next and stuff. And how do you feel about where you are now? Is this where you thought you would be, or are you sort of happy with where you are right now after a couple of years after the PhD?
Yeah, I love my job. I really enjoy the kinds of questions I work on and people I work with. I've been fortunate enough to have really great supervisors during my PhD, and a mentor on the postdoc to actually help me navigate this world of both the academia and now also mentors in the practitioner world. So I think it sort of is helping me find my place in the field. And I think I see myself being in a position like this going forward, more like technical specialist role at some policy institutions, which I think goes back to your question, Merle, that you were asking, how is the industry panning out in terms of a role for people like us, and what I guess you might want to do as well. I think initially it was like a traditional managerial role and a managerial trajectory where after some level you have to sort of not do those, or like you're not required to do those technical roles or a technical job. But now you have these dual trajectories where you can either be a manager in the traditional sense, or you can be a technical specialist, which is equivalent to being a manager, but you still work with a smaller team of like technical specialists and analysts, where you lead on some of these bigger technical projects. So that is kind of the route I want to go into, and it sort of suits both my academic interests and like being in a practitioner setting.
Yeah, fair enough. So there is no real desire to actually full on go back into the academic trajectory then?
At the moment, not. But like John Gathergood, Neil Stewart, your supervisor, Merle.
Yep.
So like academics like them are basically sitting in the academic world doing exactly like things that I would love to be doing in a few years' time. But I think to get there, not everybody gets to their position. So it would be ideal to be doing the kind of work I do, being only in academia and in a great place. But at the moment, I don't entirely see myself moving back.
Yes. No, that's good.
Any specific reason for that?
The grass is actually greener outside. Is that the case?
Probably, I think.
I mean, I've got one last question. So I'm always interested in this question of how people, I mean, specifically, I guess, early career researchers in my field, how you define success. What does it mean to you right now to be successful? And did that evolve over the course of sort of your PhD and your, professional journey?
Yes, I think it did evolve how I see success, because on the PhD, you're trained to think of success as publishing as many research papers in top field journals and having even before you finish your PhD in certain universities. But I think as I evolved and moved to the position that I work in now, success is what insights are you bringing through your research? How are they applicable? And nobody really cares about where you get them published at the end of it. Are they affecting the group of people that your research is meant to target? And how is it affecting? Is it doing any good to them? So I think that would be the ultimate definition, to see the insights of my research being rolled out on a wider scale, helping people improve their financial outcomes, because that's the field I work in, and just doing good research that is good because it affects and not because it gets published in a top field.
Yeah, that's very refreshing and nice to hear. Sometimes I need to remind myself of that. I think that sounds far more satisfying and wholesome and soul, curating rather than thinking about how many publications you have and how many rejections you have. So no, that gives
absolutely. Looking at actual impact and not journal impact factor.
Yeah,
exactly.
There we go.
Yeah, and I think this emphasis on publications and to get a good academic job is it does discourage you a little bit, because at that early stage in your career, you do need that confidence to be able to say, my research is going to be valid, helpful, impactful, and you don't get that validation quite early on in your career.
Yeah.
It's really hard to keep up your self-confidence sometimes. And in those instances, it's actually nicer to be on this other side, because you do see this immediate direct feedback coming in through your work, which are more shorter-term projects. Yeah, and that just keeps you going. And then you realize, maybe my longer-term research projects aren't that bad after all.
Yeah, maybe this is all going somewhere. Maybe I did all that work and there's a good outcome from it. Yeah, I like that. We always give our guests the opportunity to plug something at the end of our episode. So, Jesal, is there anywhere you would like to send the listener after they finished, listening to this episode, where they can sort of keep up to date with your work? Or this is your moment. Go for it. Plug everything.
So I, like any academic would, I have a website as well where I try to keep things up to date. So that's a good way to know what I'm doing and what I'm up to. And also reach out to me if you're interested in finding out more about the kind of role I do and the kind of projects I work on. So very happy to connect.
Perfect. We'll make sure your website and your preferred email address is linked down below, so people can have the path of least resistance in getting in contact with you.
Perfect. And thank you so much for having me.
Okay, that was us talking to Jesal, and I thought it was an absolutely great conversation. I think we learned a lot, and it's nice to know that this hybridity that we've talked about throughout the first 2 seasons almost continuously, because we're consistent like that that is actually also already possible at like an early level, so in this case at the postdoc. So that's good stuff. Gives me hope. Hope.
No, it's serious hybridity in action, and I think it's really cool just to hear about another trajectory or pathway into this sort of middling space, because most of the people who we've talked to who we have given them the name of hybrids, or given themselves the name of hybrids, have sort of crossed over. I don't know, they're more established in their careers now. Sure. At the point where we're talking to them, so it's cool to get the perspective of someone who is trying to forge a career right from the get-go, right in the middle of these two worlds. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like there is a set path which is equal parts frightening and also exciting because you get to just, chase the projects you want to chase. There's no like prescription of, like in academia, you need to get a postdoc, you need to get 3 publications, and then you need to go to the job bank over 2 years. And, there doesn't seem to be any of that rigmarole treadmill aspect to it. But obviously great for Nottingham to be represented as well. Big fan of having 2 Nottingham people versus you as the lowly Warwick representative for once on this podcast.
You make it sound as if we've already interviewed half of Warwick, both
I think
academic
we have.
and PhD population. We have not.
A fair few.
Jesus Christ. A fair who even. Anyway, just moving back from this completely crafted dynamic from, between Nottingham and Warwick, who, by the way, are very close alliance partners and friends anyway, so none of this rigmarole. But no, it's just really interesting to look at a hybrid, especially someone who, and I thought it was really interesting that she said that she approached a PhD as just yet another degree, get it finished as soon as you can, A stars across the board, and move on with life. And I do think that is not a very academic mindset towards the work. Like she said, if she had research projects, that continued after the PhD, it might have been to her benefit. But it is a very efficient way to deal with something where you're looking at something. It's like this thing is 3 or maybe 4 years and it needs to get done. And I don't want to drag any of the research projects beyond the submission deadline. I don't think there's anything wrong with that mindset per se, especially if you're not aiming to go into a postdoc, which, for those who don't know, a postdoc very often is used to just set up your research portfolio even further. So stuff that you haven't finished in your PhD, that is stuff that you can finish in your postdoc, aim for higher level publications and make yourself more employable in the academic job market. That is essentially what a postdoc is for. Unless you do a much more industry-oriented postdoc, of course, then things are a bit different. Several shades of grey here, several pathways to take.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, very much so. And, we've really enjoyed bringing you this early career researcher series of Questioning Behaviour Podcast. Hopefully it's helpful to bring down the mystique and the curtain behind what happens after the PhD, and also be able to amplify some really new exciting voices who are just sort of starting off, like being pushed out of the PhD nest into the field doing some great work. So thank you, dear listener, for listening to us ramble on for these last couple of minutes. But yeah, we hope you're enjoying the series and we're excited to be bringing you more in season 3 to come.
Yes. So see you again next week, where we bring you an interview series with another big fish in the field, I guess, as I would distinguish the series, and hopefully see you again in another 2 weeks, where you can hear more from our early career researchers and life after the PhD, that mysterious light at the end of the tunnel, which does seemingly seem to exist. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I've been told there is life beyond the PhD.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love.